Thanks so much everyone for watching. We've got an epic lineup tonight of speakers. We've got an awesome panel here. Amazing group of functional doctors, technology, activists for a leap forward in medicine.
Our goal is to make it easy for practitioners to learn in community.
This ecosystem that is being set up by the meetup groups, we believe will be the future ecosystem of this evolved primary care network, and it all revolves around you.
Welcome to the Functional Forum. Thanks for joining us in the charge to accelerate the evolution of medicine. Please welcome your host, James Maskell.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Really excited to be here again for another Functional Forum. I got a super snazzy background in case you haven't noticed already. And I'm super grateful to be here with Dr. Kristine Burke, who's going to be live with us today on the Functional Forum. It is February 7th, 2022. And today we are going to be talking about uric acid and uric acid metabolism. There's a lot of interesting things going on in this world, and I think you'll find that we've got some great content for you here today. New, inspiring, interesting content, taking functional medicine into new places that it hasn't been before, and making functional medicine more and more relevant for more and more types of doctors and specialists. So I guess let's welcome to the Functional Forum, Dr. Kristine Burke. Welcome, Doctor.
Hey, James. How are you?
I'm really well. So for those of you who know, Dr. Burke has been on the forum a few times before. And I think this time last year, we were talking about environmental toxins and the gut. But, you're making a special, participation this evening because as well as being the local functional medicine doctor here where I live, you're also now my doctor since I established care in September, and I'm super grateful for you. I guess what I want to ask you is, you've been running the Folsom practitioner meetup since even before the Functional Forum started. So I think 2012, 2013. Tell us how that got started and why you started that and why you've continued it over all these years.
Yeah. So actually our Functional Forum meetup was started by Dr. Bill Barley, who's another functional medicine physician here in our local area. And he just wanted to create community of the functional medicine providers that were in our area so that we could get together, we could talk about cases, or we could learn together, lecture to each other. And so that was how it all got started. And then you came and visited me, and we decided that we were going to transition it into the Functional Forum meetup based on the Functional Forum that you produce. So that's kind of how it all got started.
It's great. Well, unlike anyone else, you are actually going to be on the forum tonight, and then tomorrow night be over there in Folsom for the local get-together. How much pressure does that put on you to perform tonight?
Well, it is what it is, right?
Yeah. All right, so we're going to talk tonight a little bit about uric acid as a sort of a window into metabolic dysfunction. We're going to get a little bit personal later. I have previously on this channel had a doctor go through like my whole genetic screening, but there's nothing, you can't really change that in most ways. And this is getting a little bit more personal, but we'll come to that later. As someone who's a functional medicine doctor and someone who is sort of primary care-ish, right? And that you see a lot of different conditions. Before I told you that there was going to be Dr. Perlmutter's book and, that I was going to see you as a patient, how high on the totem pole was uric acid for you as far as, something that you were considering and thinking about day-to-day in clinical practice?
Yeah, I was on a pretty low rung on that totem pole. We knew that it was related to metabolic dysfunction, and it was something that we were monitoring in our annual wellness assessment. But honestly, beyond just seeing it as a marker among many markers that were usually indicating some metabolic dysfunction, I didn't really give it a lot of attention other than gout, and more gout. So if somebody had a mildly elevated uric acid, but they didn't have gout, we were focusing on their metabolic health and their eating and all the things that we do in functional medicine, but I wasn't really paying attention specifically to the risks that uric acid has now, having read the book that I know about.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we'll get into that. I mean, I guess to kick off the forum now, we've got a special interview with Dr. David Perlmutter. Now, we've had Dr. Perlmutter on the show before, and obviously always about brain health, and I get into that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some time to watch the whole Perlmutter interview. It is absolutely stacked with tons of great information. There's incredible clinical information there. There's all kinds of relevant information, no matter what kind of practice you have. I really think, and you'll see how he describes it there, that he's interested in growth. This is the year of growth here at the Evolution of Medicine. I think what he came to recognize is that even though, he's a neurologist, he was kind of acting as a neurologist that was really interested in metabolism. And I think this is just like the next level of that, going deeper into really understanding root cause metabolism, really understanding that this one marker could be valuable, and actually pulling together threads of research from many different places. Now, before we go there, I just want to share a little bit, because Dr. Burke's meetup is not the only one that is happening. And since the last meeting, I've got some super exciting news, is that the community software that we've been working on to build these communities is live. And so there are communities. If you watched on Monday, you'll know on the email on Saturday, you'll see that I announced that all of these groups were starting to kick off again. So we've got Austin, Birmingham, Alabama, Charlotte, North Carolina, Denver, Chicago, Houston, Phoenix, and San Antonio. And then we've got new groups coming soon in Portland, Oregon, in Washington, and also in New York. I think we've got some stuff happening in Nashville and San Diego soon, Dubai, Lisbon. We've had all kinds of interesting conversations. So if you are interested in building community, we should have got the Sacramento one up on there. We'll get that on next time. But ultimately, what we're here to do at the Evolution of Medicine is to help facilitate local leaders to build communities and make it really easy to make them strong and sustainable. It's not easy. But I think we've solved a number of the key problems that made it unsustainable and difficult in the past. So we're super excited for that. We are live here, so I'm coming to you live. We're here. So if you have questions that come up, if you're watching live, go to Twitter. You can use hashtag Functional Forum, and I'll be on there looking for questions, and we'll have Dr. Burke to answer any questions to do with either something that she says, or maybe something that Dr. Perlmutter says, because Dr. Burke has read the book now, even though it's not even out yet. We got it on preprint. So without further ado, let's start with this special interview from Dr. David Perlmutter. Enjoy. So a warm welcome back to the Evolution of Medicine platform and the Functional Forum. Dr. David Perlmutter, so glad to have you back. Welcome.
I am delighted to see you again and delighted to be back. This is great.
So you've been the go-to expert in the functional medicine brain world, obviously, for as long as I've known you, and you had a number of books, and you've written a book with your son, and you sort of, I don't know, maybe gone as far as you could into that area. There's been a lot of great information. I think it's helped a lot of people. The new book, which I have here, is called Drop Acid, and it's about uric acid. So, can you just tell us about that journey? How do you get from one to the other, and why did you feel like this was the most important thing to be talking about now?
I will. For me, my depth of exploration over the past couple of decades has really been looking at metabolic issues. And by that, I mean things like blood sugar and body weight and inflammatory markers. And certainly my interest has been in the brain, as you characterized, because metabolic problems affect the brain quite dramatically. So anything that can give us an understanding and therefore a leg up in terms of reining in this pervasive metabolic mayhem that is now global, I'm going to be interested in, because it affects the brain, but it affects the heart, it affects the entire body. So, the number one cause of death on the planet right now are these chronic degenerative conditions like heart disease and Alzheimer's and cancer and diabetes, not some kind of viral infection, though that gets all the attention. So what's killing people globally are metabolic issues. And frankly, our metabolic issues are is actually far more important in terms of metabolism than we could ever have realized in the past. Yeah, we learned about uric acid. We learned what a normal level of uric acid level is, but always in the context of gout. And, now that we recognize that uric acid is playing a pivotal role in causing metabolic issues, it really needs a spotlight. There was a 2009 article written by researchers in Japan called Uric Acid in Metabolic, actually Japan and Turkey, Uric Acid in Metabolic Syndrome from Innocent Bystander to Central Player. So it's not just that uric acid happens to be elevated in people who have a high BMI or obese, or people who are pre-diabetic or diabetic or have insulin resistance or high blood pressure. It's actually fundamentally involved in the causation of these problems. And that's a good thing because for most of our time on this planet, it paid for us to survive that we would make more fat and we would raise our blood pressure and raise our blood sugar and be insulin resistant. We always say, oh, insulin resistance, that's a terrible thing. My gosh, we have to do everything we can to battle it. The reality is that was a survival mechanism for our primate ancestors and certainly Paleolithic humans as well. When they became insulin resistant, it allowed them to make more, allowed them to have a higher blood sugar. And when they had increased production of blood sugar, that was a good thing as well. And production of body fat allowed them to survive when they couldn't find food. It just comes to conflict with us today when, overwhelmingly we have an overabundance of food and very calorie-dense foods. So this mechanism that we have in place through uric acid that tells the body, hey, make a lot of fat because you're going to need it. That's just, in conflict with our current environment where we're eating a lot of those inputs into uric acid and signaling our body to get ready for the winter that never comes.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I could see all of the themes of your work, metabolic, ancestral health, coming together. So that makes a lot of sense. Well, why don't we dive into the physiology first, early on in the interview while everyone's still paying the most attention. Get us into the physiology of uric acid, how it's made, and how it becomes that marker of metabolic flexibility.
I like the way you characterize that last part because we now put uric acid in the same category as blood sugar, blood pressure, BMI, because it's so valuable and it's much easier to bring under control than the things I just mentioned, and actually paves the way to get those under control as well. So uric acid is really only made from three things, and that makes understanding this metabolism very straightforward. Only three things create uric acid in the human body. They are purines, which are the breakdown products of cells that contain DNA and RNA. We'll talk about that in a bit. Alcohol in its various forms. Some forms of alcohol really have no effect on uric acid. Other forms are pretty dramatic. And finally, the real biggest issue these days, and that is a sugar called fructose. That is the biggest demon of all. And, there's so much written about the metabolic consequences of eating fructose, but, that was first described in 1970 in the journal The Lancet, that higher levels of fructose consumption were associated with metabolic issues, but we never understood the how and why. We never understood how that happened. And now, as we see that fructose is metabolized into this messenger molecule called uric acid, this signaling molecule telling us alarmingly to get ready for winter, that we really get our arms around why fructose is such an issue. And, the average uric acid in Americans in the 1920s was 3.5. Now it's 6. And that increase over the decades has perfectly paralleled our increased consumption of the sugar fructose. So fructose, when it's metabolized, forms uric acid. Purines, which come from DNA and RNA breakdown, we might find higher levels of purines in foods like liver and kidney and anchovies, sardines, mussels, and scallops. And then, of course, alcohol. But it turns out that the type of alcohol really is important. Hard liquor raises uric acid. Wine consumption is associated in men with a pretty neutral uric acid and actually associated with a slightly lower uric acid in women. But the big player is beer. And, far be it from me to castigate beer during NFL playoff season. But I will say that beer is a problem on two accounts. First, it has alcohol, and it's also very, very high in purines because it's made from brewer's yeast. Very dense, very, a lot of genetic material that's broken down into these purines. So that said, we know that beer causes a lot of uric acid to be made. It signals the body to make fat. And hence now we know where the beer belly is coming from because we're double targeting uric acid. And, we see these powerful correlations of elevated uric acid with things like obesity. And I would say, beyond obesity, even some very serious issues like risk of death, for example. One study, a Japanese study, looked at 90,000 people, 42,000 men, 48,000 women, followed them for 8 years. And at the beginning of the study, they measured their uric acid, and then they followed them for 8 years, and they determined, well, what happened to them? And what they found was actually very interesting, that the people who had the highest uric acid had a 16% increased risk of what is called all-cause mortality, meaning they died of something, whatever. Yeah. They had a 39% increased risk of cardiovascular mortality and a 35% increased risk of death from stroke. So that said, I mean, it really, that's an association kind of metric, but it really is pretty powerful. That risk of death is so strongly related to your entry into the study, your entry uric acid level.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, how long have you been, I guess, following this story? Because it seems like you said there was some science there from 2009. Has this been on the back burner of your mind for a while? And I guess the question I have is, if someone comes into your office with gout, then you may look for uric acid as a number to check out to see what's going on. But in my estimation, I don't know, maybe you wouldn't look at that number if it wasn't gout. And so,
good point. That's missing something very, very valuable. And this is not your grandfather's gout anymore. This is, or your grandfather's uric acid. We all learned that, maybe one lecture in medical school that, well, if you have gout, likely your uric acid's elevated, you need to use allopurinol or febuxostat or a drug to bring it down. End of story. And, in functional medicine, our story doesn't end like that. Our story ends at A, why is it elevated? And B, how can we bring it down without first reverting to the drugs? And C, might a problem like this mean something else as well? Those are the kind of three important tenets of functional medicine. Well, as it relates to gout, it's more than uric acid. There are a lot of inputs into gout, well beyond uric acid, but having a very high uric acid does tend to set the stage for gout. Second, the drugs target a specific enzyme called xanthine oxidase that is very much towards the end of the metabolism of fructose, purines, and alcohol in the formation of uric acid. So if you target that enzyme, you reduce the formation of uric acid. That's how the drugs work. But as it relates to the functional medicine model, we know, for example, that things like luteolin and quercetin dramatically target xanthine oxidase to the extent that they're almost comparable to using drugs. So even if you were a gout patient and wanted to lose uric acid or lower uric acid, my thought would be that above all, do no harm, add in some quercetin, 500 milligrams per day, or luteolin, 100 milligrams per day, and follow the uric acid, see how you're doing. Follow the frequency of gout attacks and see how you're doing. So finally, the big story is that well beyond what we learned in medical school about gout and uric acid, now we look at uric acid through a whole new lens, the lens of metabolic diseases, and how empowering it is for us as practitioners to be able to have another tool to rein in weight gain and insulin resistance and hypertension and hypertriglyceridemia and dyslipidemia by bringing uric acid under control. And something I thought about this morning is perhaps it may even be valuable in PCOS, a polycystic ovarian syndrome. Those women have dramatically elevated uric acid, or a much higher risk for having uric acid. And we need to unpack that a little bit at some point. But anything that we can do to keep people metabolically more intact, you're going to get a lot of traction out of that. You're going to get a lot of squeeze, a lot of juice from that squeeze. That's for sure.
That's clear. So can you describe with us, I guess, the pathway by which elevated uric acid causes these downstream effects? Maybe as an example, like Alzheimer's, seeing as that's something you've worked with a lot.
Well, let's first just deconstruct what uric acid is doing once it's produced. And as you know, we've spoken for years about some of these fundamental mechanisms that underlie, for example, Alzheimer's disease. Let me take a step back and look at a study that was published in the Japanese literature that looked at 1,600 people, adults, follow them for 12 years, and every 2 years, so 6 times, they would have a neurocognitive test during the 12-year period. At the beginning of the study, they measured their, believe it or not, uric acid level. Those individuals who had a uric acid of 7 or above had about an 80% increased risk during the study of 12 years of becoming demented. They had a 55% increased risk of developing a disease for which there is no pharmaceutical treatment, called Alzheimer's disease. And they had a 166% increased risk of what is called mixed dementia or vascular dementia. So, for me as a neurologist, wow, that's pretty impressive. Again, through the lens of the idea that we don't really have a treatment for Alzheimer's. As a matter of fact, I wish we did, but we don't. So why might uric acid relate mechanistically to the changes in the brain that we see in Alzheimer's? What's going on in the Alzheimer's brain? Several important things. We know that there's increased inflammation. We know that there is increased oxidative stress. We know that there is increased damage to the mitochondria. And we know that there is problems with what are called the bioenergetics, how the brain cells are able to use basically fuel for metabolism because their mitochondria are not working appropriately. Uric acid does all of these things. It's powerfully pro-inflammatory. It's powerfully in the extracellular space. The intracellular space, powerfully pro-oxidative, leading to oxidative stress, damaging the mitochondria, and as such, leads to compromised ability of brain cells to utilize fuel to make energy. Such that, interestingly, let me unpack this, is really interesting, such that in the brains of Alzheimer's patients, though they can't utilize glucose as readily, in many areas of the brain, the glucose level actually rises because it's not being utilized. Well, what does that do? You're going to love this. A recent study demonstrated that in addition to the elevation of glucose, there is elevation of fructose. Fructose in the brain is made from glucose. Glucose, through what is called the polyol pathway, can be metabolized through something called sorbitol into fructose, meaning that we're not just involving the fructose that you may consume or hopefully now decide you're not going to consume, that we have within our bodies and in the brain pathways that will make fructose if the body thinks it needs to make fat, basically, or needs to change its metabolism and activate the uric acid. And what else does the uric acid do? Again, increases free radical mediated stress. Maybe there's a time in the brain when that's important to have. Well, free radical mediated stress to the mitochondria turns down their metabolism. And there are times when we are starving that might actually be a way of saving calories. Who knows? But the interesting point is that not just in the brain, but throughout the body, these are devastating issues brought on by uric acid, in addition to leading to insulin resistance, turning on gluconeogenesis, and inhibiting nitric oxide. And we could talk about each of those individually, but I think one of the main things to mention is, for your audience who I think kind of fancies these ideas, that, our bodies need to know whether it's time for feast or time for famine. If it's time for feast, we've got plenty of food, we have plenty of water, so we don't need to be packing fat away, right? And that's a time when the body is activating a pathway called the AMP kinase pathway, AMPK. We want to keep AMPK lit up as much as we can, because when our AMPK pathway is doing its thing, we're telling the body, don't make fat, don't store fat, burn fat, don't increase production of glucose. We don't need extra glucose floating around. And it's the reason we want to do everything we can to activate our AMP kinase pathway. On the other hand, AMP can be metabolized in a different pathway called AMPD. So instead of AMPK, we go to AMP deaminase. And when that pathway is activated, it's telling our bodies, prepare for winter, make fat, store fat, increase glucose production. Why? Because we don't know when we're going to get food again. As a matter of fact, when animals are in the fall, when bears are getting ready to hibernate, they shut off AMPK and they activate AMP deaminase. They're making and storing fat. They're getting ready to be in a situation where they're not going to be eating. So most of us want to keep AMPK lit up at all times. When AMPK is active, we're not making blood sugar more blood sugar than we need in the liver, gluconeogenesis. That's how metformin works, as a matter of fact. Metformin works to stimulate AMPK and shuts down the liver from making more glucose. That's why metformin is a diabetes drug, because it turns off excess glucose production. It's why exercise, for example, is such a good thing for blood sugar control, because it lights up AMP kinase. Like, again, quercetin, twice I've mentioned it, and berberine. These are some supplements that turn on AMP kinase, telling our body the hunting is good. You don't need to be packing the fat away for winter. But interestingly, uric acid turns AMPK off and turns on AMP deaminase. It's doing its job. It's trying to help you survive, because when uric acid is elevated, it knows it's a signal that winter is coming, and James needs to store fat if James is going to survive. We can go down either pathway. We can do everything we can to keep AMPK going, and so we'll stay lean and have the body think that it's got plenty of food, don't need to store it for the winter. Or we can activate AMP deaminase, in which case uric acid is doing what its job is, sounding the alarm that we're not going to have food in the future. It's not just food, it's water. So when the body has a sense that it's becoming dehydrated, it turns on this pathway to make more fructose and hence more uric acid. Why would that be? And a visual would be a very unique animal that walks across the desert for weeks without drinking water. How does it do it? It has a hump on its back. So I'm talking about the camel, and it can go long distances without drinking water, because guess what's inside the hump? Fat, not water. Right. So the camel's hump is filled with fat, up to 80 pounds of fat. Because when we and camels and animals burn fat, they form water, carbon dioxide and water. So that's metabolic water. So forming a body fat is a powerful mechanism activated with this fructose being turned on by dehydration, make body fat, activate uric acid, and that's a survival tool. And how does our body know when it's becoming dehydrated? The sodium goes up. So that's interesting. So our sodium going up is a signal, quick, turn on the pathway, turn glucose into fructose, make uric acid so we can make body fat, because we're dehydrated and we're probably not going to make it unless we can make enough fat, and then we can burn the fat and have a resource for water. Well, how else does your serum sodium go up? It goes up when you eat a bag of chips. It goes up when you eat those pretzels that they sell on the street in New York that who doesn't love, right?
Yeah.
But that salt in your diet will raise your body's fructose consumption and lead to, it explains now, we've never known this, but why is it that people who eat a lot of salt are fat, gain a lot of weight, have a huge increased risk of diabetes? And well, we've known the blood pressure story for an awful long time. But why would there be such a relationship between eating a lot of salt and becoming overweight or becoming diabetic? I mean, what's the mechanism? Now it's very clear. So for your viewers, I would say that the simple answer, if you've got to eat that bag of pretzels or whatever it may be, drink a lot of water with it. If you drink water, you'll dilute down that sodium. You're not going to trigger this mechanism. And yes, drinking water in this instance is going to help you lose weight. Who knew?
It's interesting. Yeah, I guess the one thing that we haven't talked about here so far, which I think would be surprising for anyone, if we were talking about gout, we're talking about uric acid, is meat, right? Because that's always like, you're talking about grandpa's diabetes, right? I mean, grandpa's uric acid and grandpa's gout, that the meat was the thing that was sort of like the fingers were pointed at. So obviously, I'd love to get your take on that, because I would imagine, I would think that there may be a situation where, a vegan activist would be like, well, of course, Perlmutter's next book is on uric acid because he's been getting everyone to eat meat for the last 10 years. And so I'm sure all of his patients now have gout.
Well, it turns out that that's not the biggest player by far. I eat meat, not much. My diet is mostly plant-based, and I've been talking about that for an awful long time for anyone who's been following me. But do I eat some meat on occasion? I do. Do I eat fish? Yes, I do. But, it was the messaging for so long, and you certainly should know this, as would your father, that, patients with gout should really avoid meat, because gout is the king of diseases and the disease of kings. Because, who could afford meat? It was the very wealthy. They eat a lot of meat, drink a lot of wine, and the next thing you know, they'd have and eat cheese, get gout, because you're eating rich foods. But more recently, I think there's been an attempt to kind of keep the fructose connection away from us, because, as you well know, in recent decades, everything has sort of stacked up to keep us from pointing the finger at sugar.
Yeah.
It's always been point the finger at fat, right? Dietary fat, because of cholesterol and heart attacks. And then more recently is point the finger at meat. But the biggest issue by far is the fructose. That's for sure. When you see 60 to 70% of the food on America's grocery store shelves that is packaged have added sweetener, and it's by and large fructose or derivative, that it's no wonder that our uric acid levels have climbed so aggressively, 3.5 in the 1920s. Now the average is 6 milligrams per deciliter, in lockstep with our fructose consumption, not in lockstep with increasing meat consumption or alcohol consumption. That has changed, but it hasn't changed all that. The thing that's really, between 1970 and 1990, our fructose consumption increased 1,000%.
Yeah.
So that's the big player. I have never been an advocate, even back in the grain brain days of 2013, of eating an awful lot of meat. And if a person is going to eat 6 to 8 ounces in a day, that's more than enough, in my opinion. So even in the grain brain days, while we were saying don't eat a lot of refined carbohydrates, hence the title, and how sugar is the enemy of the brain, it was still eating as many vegetables as you can with as many colors on your plate as you're able to achieve. So and again, if people want to eat things like the high purine types of meats, liver, kidney, mollusks, and small fish like sardines and anchovies, you may very well get away with it. And you're not going to know unless you check your uric acid. It's a simple blood test. The doctor probably already did it. It's part of the annual blood work. You can go online and get a uric acid monitor and do a finger stick and know your uric acid level in 30 seconds or less. It's available to anyone. I have my uric acid monitor right here. There it is. If I push the button, that's my most recent level. What does it say? 4.7. That's where you want to keep it. You want to keep it below 5.5. Below 7 is considered in the normal range. And I'm not about that. I'm not about in the normal range. We want to do better than normal. Normal is average. We want to be optimal. So A and B, that level is derived because that relates to gout. Anything over 7, and that starts to be when there's enough concentration of uric acid that it can extracellularly in the blood, it can start to crystallize. And one of the hallmarks of gout. But understand that as it relates to that, and this is a bit off topic, but along with getting gout crystals in your great toe, when you have elevated uric acid, it'll crystallize or can crystallize in your coronary arteries, other parts of the body, including even the prostate gland, for crying out loud, where it induces inflammation. So, even in people who've never had a gout flare-up, we've got to rein in uric acid. Now that we know, certainly the metabolic consequences of having a high uric acid, and beyond that, the fact that these crystals are forming in various parts of the body, that's important as well, because that's powerfully inflammatory.
Yeah. Well, so many interesting parallels between like continuous glucose monitor, over use of glucose and weight gain, which was, one connection. Then you've got the uric acid monitor, over use of fructose and uric acid. And like you said there, the industry influence to sort of point the finger away from glucose and fructose, makes a lot of sense after what we've seen in these.
Yeah, and I wish it were over, but it's not over yet. In February.
All right, well, something happened there. Not sure exactly what happened, but here we are. We're still live. And Dr. Burke, are you there?
I am here.
All right, that was a bit abrupt, but we made it. So I've just been like shoveling in the water. I've got the quercetin. I'm literally going to hell for leather over here. So I guess, you just probably watched that, I think maybe for the first time. What were your thoughts? What did you get from that? And what's interesting to this for you?
Oh my gosh, there's so much to unpack in all of this, just in what he was just sharing. And when you go through the book, I kind of went through it twice because there's so much information in there. I thought it was really interesting. There's so many things. The fructose connection is really, really interesting, and the data around our increased fructose consumption, and then our dramatic increase in metabolic diseases. And, we know there's a lot of factors that go into that, but this is a really interesting one. And then I thought also the shift in fat burning and kind of that ancestral reason that we get the elevated uric acid, and that's a very interesting component, and that we have to really retrain the body because our needs are different now than they were when that was something that was beneficial. So many components.
What do you think?
Go ahead.
I want to ask you about the AMPK situation, because when I heard that, I guess that was something that I kind of was recognizing that there are pathways beyond that create a level of complexity that might not make it easy to understand what's happening, under the surface.
Yeah, for sure. The AMPK piece is really interesting, and I wasn't familiar with the AMPD component of it and the importance of the differential tracking down the two pathways. So that was another thing that was really novel to me.
So when you read the books, I know you've had a chance to read it. Obviously, we only got a little bit of Perlmutter there. What were some things that stood out to you as things that, okay, I'm reading this, it's interesting, and I can't ever, go back from this. Like now that I know this, my functional medicine practice will never be the same.
Well, I took 7 pages of notes from the book. So there's a lot in there. There was a lot that I found really interesting. One of the other things that was particularly significant to me, because I do a lot of work in cardiovascular disease reversal was the interplay with elevated uric acid and decreasing nitric oxide production. And then all of the things that can lead to, including, not only insulin resistance and hypertension and decreased organ perfusion, but the very specific cardiovascular piece to that as well, and increasing the risk. So I think that to me made a connection between uric acid as an independent risk factor, not only via the metabolic derangement, and that was very novel.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's lots to unpack. So I'd highly recommend for functional medicine doctors. Sometimes books that are written for patients aren't really that interesting for doctors because you're going, a few levels deeper in your medical education. But I guess my feeling, having read it and then having gone through that interview and now passed it on to you, is that this is such a novel area that he's tapping into and bringing so much science into one place that it's almost like, this could be a practitioner book.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, the pieces, the nice thing about how he has it organized is the pieces that are somewhat bread and butter for us are kind of grouped together. And so you can really dive in and read about the novel areas and, a little bit more easily skim through some of the things that aren't novel to us as a practitioner reading a book, like you said, that's really directed at the public. So I thought that it had a lot of really practical advice too, which I thought was really useful for patients. And frankly, some of those recipes, I was like, okay, let me turn this page down. Let me turn this page down. There was some great stuff in there.
That's awesome. Well, high recommendation for everyone. Check it out. It's not out yet, but it comes out this month. It's called Drop Acid from Dr. David Perlmutter. So now, really for the first time on the forum, I'm going to sort of share, my experience with this because, ultimately, I haven't really, like most practitioners in functional medicine have a chronic illness that they overcome, and then they see the light and they practice in a new way, and it sort of opens them up that. And I never really had that in my life. There are other things that I overcome, and I used to have really bad cat allergies that I don't have anymore, and I'll leave that as a something for the future because that was something that I did deal with, but not through functional medicine, but even more interesting. But I'll come back to that in the future. So I didn't know what gout was. I'd never really heard of it. I never really understood anything about it. And then in 2005, I moved to America. I was 25 years old. And, I moved to America. And I would say about 8 months into moving to America, I had what I now recognize as a severe gout flare that I had never had before. And interestingly, I would say in those 8 months, my diet had changed for the better in a lot of ways, which is really interesting. Very different diet. So in England, growing, in those years before, I was working in London, I was drinking a lot, and I was eating a lot of bread, classic England lifestyle, basically. I didn't really know any better. I moved to America. First of all, I hardly drank anymore. I probably went from drinking like 3 days a week to drinking 1 day a week. I also went from, it was the very beginning of the naturopathic doctor that I worked with was like a Mercola devotee in 2005. So it was the very earliest days of like paleo, fat's not bad for you, you should have more fat. So I was eating like more fat and more meat probably than I had living in England, where there was a lot of like, carbohydrate rich stuff. So, and also I didn't realize what it was. I didn't know what it was. I just know that my foot was really sore, and I was sort of, I went to see some practitioners and they weren't really sure what it was too. And then I called my dad and I was like, yeah, I was just having a really bad time. I can't walk. My toes all inflamed. He's like, oh yeah, you've got gout. We've all had it. Your granddad had it. I've had it. So, my history is that I got 2 generations back of basically wine merchants, South African wine merchants. They ran vineyards and were all involved in brandy production and wine production. So it's definitely been in my family. So I had that one moment. My dad told me what it was. It kind of went away after a while. Although I was like in bed for 3 days. I was like, I couldn't really walk, and I was like walking so slow. And then basically went away again. And I didn't have it for a long time. That, for those next few years, I would say I was on a crash course of health. Like I was exercising way more. I was taking supplements. I was then working for a supplement company. So I was taking all the supplements all the different times. And then the next time that it happened, so I had one really bad one where I went to the first year that actually I went to Burning Man and I got severely dehydrated, and then I got an IV and I got the worst gout one. My foot was like this wide. And that was just like a ridiculous moment where I couldn't walk for a week and I had this insane thing, but that's just part of, I guess, what you do if you go and live in the desert and you choose to do that. But a friend of mine who's a doctor, functional medicine doctor, gave me an IV, and I think just the fluid balance went from so low to so high, but that was crazy. And then I would say since then, it sort of started popping back up. And one of the times that it popped back up was the next year when I went to England and we were doing a functional forum with Dr. Chatterjee and Mike Ash. And on the plane on the way over, my foot swelled up and I was like hobbling into the Royal Society of Medicine. And Mike Ash had like his favorite thing, which was bicarbonate of soda. What do you call that in America? It's got a different name. Do you know that? What's it called here?
No, we call it bicarb.
Yeah, bicarb and vitamin C, high dose, mixed in water, and chug it down. And it went away. It went away in like 20 minutes. It was magic. So I managed to do the show. Then the next time I was in England next year, it happened again. And this time I was with Dr. Chatterjee and Mike wasn't there and I didn't have the stuff. So he went and wrote a prescription for colchicine. And now I had some colchicine just when it came up. And I would say, it slowly started happening. But, the thing is that was really hard for me to understand is that I was progressively getting healthier, if anything. Like I was losing weight, I was working out, I was drinking less. And then it sort of all came to a head last summer. And that's why we ended up working, is that like, I was basically like permanently disabilitated. I was like last summer in August, I just had this flare that was ongoing. I was moving house and I was, it was really, really rough. And I was like, at that point, I basically quit drinking. Like I wasn't drinking at all. And I was eating, healthy. There were certain parts that, weren't particularly healthy, but like, in general, we eat all organic, we eat a lot of vegetables, it's mainly paleo, which is the way I've eaten, pretty much for all this time. Maybe too much salt, I have to say. Like Perlmutter, that did get me thinking about salt and what we put salt on and how things are salted. So I think about that. But, that's when I called you, because I was like, hey, this doesn't seem to be like following the path. If it was really just like a linear relationship between like alcohol and salt and, fructose even, like I'm not drinking, who's drinking fruit juice? Like I'm not drinking a lot of fruit juice. My kid has a little bit, but I don't have it. So yeah, I wanted to try and work out what was going on. And I believe, most people don't believe it, but I've never done any of the functional testing because I just wasn't sick. And, I didn't want to do it. I just didn't have a need to do it. So here we are, James Maskell,
want to know.
41 years old, functional medicine patient. Actually the thing that held it down for a long time was this uric acid formula that I had for a while. And that was vitamin C, potassium, devil's claw, cherry, quercetin, bromelain, and grape. And I still take, I'd be taking that. But again, all these things just stopped working basically. And I was just like completely incapacitated. So that brings us to our new relationship. And I just wanted to share that because I guess it's probably the classic male functional medicine story, right? You don't do anything until it's like the worst, until it's too late. Well, not too late, until it's like so debilitating that you can't do anything with it. And I just thought if I just, my mind was, look, if I just, keep getting healthier, eventually it'll go away, and then it didn't go away. So,
yeah.
Now enter Dr. Kristine Burke. We've known each other for, 8 or 9 years and threatened to become a patient a few times, but never actually followed through. And now I'm a patient. So talk us through, what is your process for onboarding new patients? Where did you vary from your normal process? And sort of what was, what were some of your suspicions? How would you deal with a case like mine? And what's the functional medicine lens on this?
Yeah. So you were a little bit of a hot mess when you came in. And so we did, when we went through your timeline, it was interesting because usually there's a pretty good smoking gun, like especially as an experienced functional medicine practitioner, as you go through someone's timeline and you kind of watch how their life and their health has unfolded, you see the clues. And there were a few clues along the way, but there was definitely no smoking gun. Like you said, there was this disparity between, as your health behaviors improved, your gout started getting more frequent, and it was just it was a bit of a puzzle. And so we started off with doing some foundational testing. And so you want me to go into those?
Well, I guess, one of the things I wanted to share was that, I've got a friend who had a ridiculous gout flare when they had mold, and then they dealt with the mold, and then they got better on the other side of it. So like the last thing I wanted to be was mold. So, I know we did the mold test, right? I had to do the glutathione and the Great Plains labs. We did the Genova test, and we did, what else? The oat test. So that was, a sort of a window in, and it was definitely an interesting learning process.
Yeah, and one of the things that was in the book talked about the interplay between the gut microbiome and the production of uric acid. And that was one of the things that I had no idea about, that after reading the book, I know I was texting you because it was really fascinating, because it tied up exactly with what we had found in your GI effects result, that the specific type of dysbiosis that we were seeing was with an elevation in the Bacteroides class, and that increases the frequency of gout attacks because it actually promotes the production of uric acid by promoting the xanthine oxidase dehydrogenase enzyme, which converts the purines into uric acid. And so I thought that was a really interesting finding, and it was probably the most profound thing that we came across, other than having some other, yeast dysbiosis. But we were both surprised that the mold testing was negative. And so that was fascinating, because we thought we would find something really easy to.
I was very happy about that, because
I was too.
You don't want to mess around with that. And I've had enough friends who have had enough of that, for a couple lifetimes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So on that microbe, if you now sort of understand that history, are there things about that sort of food and other mix that would lead to the overproduction of that bacteria?
Yeah, well, certainly the phases in your life where you were eating less healthfully. And then I think there were some intermittent times of things not being as healthy for you, and then times that it was. And it must have been something about that perfect storm, that in times when the food choices weren't very good, it allowed an overgrowth. And then when the food choices were better, those bacterial species were able to flourish more instead of getting replaced with the more beneficial species. And I think just over time, you developed a greater and greater level of dysbiosis that you weren't able to turn around. And that's what we're working on turning around now. And hopefully what we'll see is that the uric acid levels will come down along with that.
Well, one of the things that I have done actually since I got back is order the uric acid tester, because I'm really interested in following that regularly. And also, I want to say one thing is that, I guess previously I would sort of characterize myself as anti-drug, basically, or anti-pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. And, something that sort of happened in 2019 when my partner Gabe passed away is I felt like, if I learned anything from his story, it was that there are these two sort of competing worlds, and that ultimately these two worlds didn't really mesh in the middle, right? There was allopathic medicine over here that's all drugs and all surgeries and whatever, and then you have alternative medicine over here that's don't have any drugs, and that there's no real way. In Gabe's case, very, very sadly, there was no connection between the cardiologists and obviously the people in his life in the allopathic world who he didn't trust because he'd had cancer twice, and he didn't trust. And then on the natural health, probably overly trusting people that in retrospect were totally off base about what was going on with him. in the repercussions of that, I thought to myself, look, what are we here to do? We're really here to build a bridge between these two things so that we can optimize the medical system. And so, I'm, on the basis of our agreement and really that understanding, I'm excited about working with the best of all the worlds. And I'll tell you for nothing that doing the allopurinol for a while it was kind of like difficult to do because I've never really taken pharmaceuticals at all, certainly allowed me to like enjoy the time with my father and my daughter in South Africa in a way that it was very difficult to do before then. And to be able to now get to the root cause and do some of this testing to understand. And I'm excited now to jump into some of these fungal protocols and deal with it. And then, build it up with all this other stuff that I've got here. What have I got? We got some MitoCore, we got some microbiome labs, IgG 2000. So, we're going to be reseeding after we kill some stuff. And that's the classic for us. I mean, it couldn't be more functional medicine.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and like you said, when we met and you had that big trip coming, and we needed a way to create comfort for you so that you could go and experience with your family what you were looking for. And that, using the pharmaceutical, like you said, as a bridge in that particular scenario allowed us to do both. It created some space for you to not be chronically inflamed as well. And then it created some space for me to get the data that I needed to really direct what therapy was going to be hopefully most beneficial for you.
Absolutely. And is that like a best practice that you've seen after doing this for a decade or more?
Bridging using pharmaceuticals. I mean, I think like a lot of my functional medicine colleagues, I don't reach for pharmaceuticals very often, but there is a time and a place for their use. And so I think, in your scenario where you were doing all of the things that we would ask of you, you were changing your diet, you'd eliminated alcohol, you were doing tart cherry and you were doing the supplements that benefit reducing uric acid, and nothing was working and you were miserable. That was the right time for that. But it's not that I would do that with every gout patient necessarily, right? It really depends on the needs of that patient. But alleviating suffering should always be one of the things that we keep in the forefront, because I think it's easy as functional medicine practitioners to get really focused on our root cause work and trying to, figure out the physiology and turn things around. And meanwhile, our patient may be suffering. And if we don't remember that we've got to balance both sides of that, it's easy sometimes to be looking too much upstream and forget where we are, right? Be present where we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I come to really appreciate that, now that I've been sort of in it a little bit, and really grateful for being able to sort of, personally experience this, to go on my own journey in this year of growth, to share. I mean, look, no one gets less sympathy than the gout patient in medicine. I think even type 2 diabetes, it's almost like, well, look, there's this impossibly unhealthy environment, so, it's not your fault. But gout, still has the disease of King's ring to it. But I bet that was a scam by the fructose industry all along. We knew
exactly.
it.
Now we know better.
Yeah,
you read the book and you know better.
That's so true. Well, awesome. Well, look, I just want to share before we leave here. Thank you to the sponsors here at the Evolution of Medicine and the Functional Forum. Lots of great resources. I know Dr. Burke uses Servo because I'm in it, in the patient portal, and we did the Genova test. And I know that, there's some of the other resources on here that you use. Thank you for being such a leader in the community and putting on the meetup. I'm excited tomorrow night to go and meet the community there. And we've got some exciting ideas on growing the community here in the Sacramento area. Lots of exciting things happening in this area, and I'm excited to hear from you. If you want to be part of a meetup, start your own meetup, build a community, get in touch with us. Maybe we can put you in touch with a partner. Maybe you can just run it yourself. But we're really building a much more sustainable model. And this is a perfect lead into the next 2 months. We're going to be doing a couple of functional forums, actually a series on biotoxin illness and getting into some of these like chronic infections. One, because it's critical, a lot of people are dealing with this. But second, because I think there's a lot to learn from mold and biotoxin illness for long COVID. And Mark Hyman last month on the Functional Forum just shared what a huge opportunity it is for the Functional Forum community to be more relevant than ever in the future of medicine by dealing with something that's obviously a huge pain point for a large part of the conversation. I had COVID since this last, when the last time I did the forum, it was kind of a joke that I was COVID positive when I did it. And I've actually experienced, a couple of interesting sort of knock-on effects, not chronic, but knock-on effects from having it. And so I think there's a lot that, that we can all do to bridge that gap and add value as much as possible. So hope to see you March 7th. We'll be back for the first of a 2-part series on biotoxin illness. We've got some great speakers coming down, some of the leading lights in understanding this, and we'll be talking about it in the context of its own issue, but also in the context of long COVID and chronic infection. So Dr. Burke, thank you for being with us. I know this has been a great journey. I'm really excited to extend and deepen our friendship through me becoming a patient and going through this journey. And I just really appreciate you and the way that you run your practice and all your staff and the team there. It's always a great example for the rest of medicine and for the rest of the functional medicine community and everyone who's listening. Thanks for being part of the Functional Forum. I think you can learn a lot from tonight's forum, but also from Dr. Perlmutter's book. We've got lots of exciting things coming up. So thanks so much for tuning in.